You bet. We're back on a given Monday at noon with John Davidan of Hawaii Pacific University. He's a history professor there. We can never understand the present or the future, for that matter, without understanding history. And so
Exactly.
yesterday we had a 1 hour recitation by the president, and it included American exceptionalism. So we thought we'd study that a little bit because John and I have talked about that before. It's ingrained
Right.
into American history, and
Yeah.
Trump was really going hard on that. This is the greatest country on earth. And the question is that true? Is that a true statement? Was it ever a true statement? John David and
Mm.
HPU history professor, what do you think?
Okay. Thanks, Jay. Thanks for having me on. So it's an interesting question. I think it's, on the surface, you can say, no, we're not an exceptional nation. And the Trump presidency is proving this. The
Well,
truth
what
is
what
that,
was it? What is it? In the best of times, when the
right,
term came
right.
into use, what was the idea?
Yeah. Oh, that's the evolution of the term. That's another very interesting topic. But so when we talk about exceptionalism, what we're talking about is two things. We're talking about the idea that the United States is a unique, exceptional, a unique place among all the nations of the world. And then, so that's the first thing, this idea of uniqueness. And then the second thing is this idea that the United States is also, what's the second thing, Jay? We're unique and we're also
The best.
the best, right? Superior to everyone else. So this is now the basis for this is very old. We go all the way back to the John Winthrop sermon that he gave on the Arbella, which was a ship sailing across the Atlantic and landed in the New World, landed in Massachusetts Bay in 1619. So we go all the way back to John Winthrop in his sermon when he talked about the idea that this new place could be a city on a hill, which was essentially what he was talking about as a model for the rest of the world. And this is very steeped in religion at that point, and it's also steeped in the idea that there's a lot of pressure on this community to succeed, these Puritans to succeed, and if they don't succeed, then it will play very badly. In some sense, the whole covenant with God is in play with these Puritans because they're sick and tired of what's been happening to them in England. They're being persecuted in England, and then they come to Massachusetts Bay, and the pressure's on them to make it work. And so that's really where the term exceptional. That's where we pulled it from. Now, John Winthrop didn't use the term exceptionalism. The first use of this term, I think, is quite recent. Actually, I think it's probably mid 20th century, maybe even after World War II, that the actual term is being used. So, but it's become strangely. Okay, this is a very complicated issue, but strangely, in the time in which the term has come into use and become more and more a kind of litmus test for presidents. We talked about this before, Jay, but of course, President Obama was asked, do you believe in American exceptionalism? The Republicans thought they could kind of hook him, get him into trouble on this. And he gave an academic answer. He said, yes, but all nations believe that they're exceptional in some ways. So he, in a way, he foiled them by giving the most honest and kind of smart, nuanced answer you can give, and that's quite true, right? I've read books that studied Israeli exceptionalism, British exceptionalism, the Japanese had exceptionalism. So it's a very common thing for modern nations to have this idea that somehow they're special and they're superior. So it's not just the United States that is not even exceptional in its own idea that it's exceptional. So there's a lot
But
of ramifications.
de facto, John. I mean, there was a time, maybe
Yeah,
as you say, after World War II, when we were the leader of the free world. that we were charitable and generous and kind and moral, and a leader making the world a better place for democracy and all American ideals. And you could say in that period of time we really were exceptional. That nobody rose to the level of the United States in so many ways, including military power. But you
I,
wouldn't say that today. Would you say that today in
I
the same
don't.
definition?
No, no, Jay, no, no. I don't think so. I don't think we were exceptional. Okay, look, we practiced Jim Crow segregationism in the South. World War
Oh,
II
all
didn't
right.
change that.
Okay.
Uh, you know, the the military itself was segregated. African American troops were attacked by white troops in the war. When they came home from the war, there were race riots because these African American troops, these veterans, wanted the same rights as whites. Um, it was no, I don't think so. I mean, there is, I just don't think so. I think that's a I'll be honest with you. I think that's a fairy tale that Donald Trump would like to tell us, that there was this time when we were exceptional, and now we're moving back to that time. His slogan in 2016 was make the United States, make America great again, right? So referring back to a time when we were in fact greater than we are now. So it played upon people's nostalgia for that time. So no, I don't think so. Certainly, you can argue that there are instances throughout American history where citizens and even non-citizens rose up and said, "Hey, we got to change the system." And it's not American exceptionalism; it's actually an idea that you can improve what you've already got. And certainly there are threads. Let's call them threads. You have constitutional threads. You have the threads from the Declaration of Independence. You have these threads that go through American history, and people grab onto those threads and say, "Hey, this is what makes the United States, a wonderful place to live in." And they use those threads to try to push us towards a greater good. Kind of we the people, forming, a more perfect union. I like that. Now, the word perfect has some problems too, but I like that the Constitution starts with we the people, and it starts with our goal of forming a more perfect union. I like that. I think that's perfectly fine, and it doesn't have to argue that somehow we're more perfect than the British or the Israelis or the Japanese, or that we're actually going to become perfect. That's where I don't really like the word, because I don't think there's any way we're going to be perfect. But uh,
You talk about
so yeah,
threads, John. You talk about threads. One of the threads
yeah,
was for a long time slavery, and slavery,
right,
as I mentioned before the show, in my view, slavery was avarice. In other words, you wanted to make your money and lots of it on the back of someone else, and
right.
screw that person, and you come out ahead. And in fact, most of the
Yeah,
millionaires in the United States up until the end of the Civil War were in the South because they got rich and
that's
they were
true.
trying to hold
All of
on
them.
to it. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
all of
so
them.
and so
Yeah,
avarice plays a role, and there's always this tension between, let me protect my own stash and let me do the common good. And I think sometimes the
Jay,
common good was more important, sometimes it
Jay,
wasn't.
Jay. That's fantastic, man. You get an A there. That was great. I love that. Seriously, this is a very good point. It's always been intention. So let's talk about the 19th century some more, because you brought it up. And so de Tocqueville, let's take the great Alexis de Tocqueville, who was this French philosopher who came to the United States and wrote a book about the United States. And de Tocqueville described Americans in a way that suggests that by the 1830s, when he came to the United States and toured the United States and then wrote this book, that the United States was already developing an identity which maybe was focused on what you were talking about, on avarice. Because de Tocqueville described the United States as a nation of smallholders, small farmers. He wouldn't have described it as avarice, but maybe that's going too far to describe it as avarice. But de Tocqueville described this nation of smallholders, and he thought that the genius of the nation, because we were largely a farming nation at that point, the genius of the nation was that we had these independent farmers who owned their own land, controlled their own destinies, were highly independent. I said that already. Independent. How independent? Very independent. Actually, they were also linked into a commercial market. But so they were ambitious. They were self-supporting, and in kind of a Jeffersonian terms, they were not capable of corruption. They could support the republic by their own efforts. So de Tocqueville argued that the material circumstances of the United States were shaping an identity in which profits and material well-being was a big part of this equation. But de Tocqueville actually, I think, also associated this with a political system that would be made virtuous on the basis of these smallholders. So,
Well, we've shared an article in the Salon website, salon.com,
yeah, right.
about what Trump said and whether the country really is exceptional. And one of the interesting comments there goes to this point you're making about individualism, rugged individualism. And
Right.
right or wrong, what the author of that article said was that rugged individual is not really consistent with working for the common good. And so, you have a tension there. You have a tension between
Right.
I'm going to do individualistic things. I'm going to be strong and self-reliant and independent, and I don't really care about my neighbor. This is a tension that is also of great concern.
Right. No, that's right. No, and both good points. So yeah, um, so it's a tricky question. So you've got exceptionalism on one side. Is the United States an exceptional nation? But what you have on the other side, I think, is still the survival and the development of what I'll call civic virtue. So I don't necessarily agree with de Tocqueville's analysis. I'm not sure that he was right in that way, and so um, I tend to what. Okay, here's what I'm doing. I'm actually writing a book called The Dissenter's Guide to American History, and in that book, what I'm doing is I'm selecting out examples of civic virtue. And, it's dissent. Of course, it's opposition to the ruling power, but I define dissent pretty broadly. And so I pick people out in the revolutionary period and look at them. And what I'm trying to do is create a positive narrative of the American past that can inform us today in our thinking about our relationship to the polity, to politics in this country, and political activism and again what I call civic virtue.
Very important
So
book.
yeah,
Well, so what's the title of
yeah.
the book, John? Do you have a
Sorry.
title? What's the title?
Yeah, it's called the Dissenter's Guide to American History.
Okay, and when's it coming out?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's several publishers are looking at it. Um, it's under review, but I suspect the whole COVID issue is going to slow that down. But I'd like to think I would get a contract by the end of the summer, but I think COVID might change that. It might be the end of
Oh,
the year.
yeah,
I'm
you're gonna
not
change
sure.
everything.
Um,
So here's Trump
yeah,
yesterday, and he's using exceptionalism, right through that 1 hour diatribe,
right.
where I think the message, the takeaway, if you want to call it a takeaway, is that I'm rich. But I have given a lot to this country. You should appreciate me. You should love me for what I have done for this country. I've done a great job. The government has done a great job, including especially with coronavirus. And by the way, uh, what's his name? Rouch was not there. The fellow who really we do believe, and
Yeah. Anthony Fauci. Yeah.
uh, yeah, he was not there, and which means I think that Trump took him off the stage because he was not on Trump's team. Anyway, so the point though is he used exceptionalism, okay, as a way to gain public support for his own political position and ultimately, his election, the campaign in
Right.
November
Right.
and the election. And what's interesting, though, is he says the greatest country on earth. We are doing a great job. We are capable of doing the most marvelous things, on and on like that. And I, as your president, I'm a war president. And we have to come together. So he used the notion of exceptionalism to ask people to come together behind him. And I thought that was very interesting because again, I question whether we are exceptional. I question whether he's exceptional. Well, he is exceptional, but in ways that you might not compliment him for.
Well, yeah, he's exceptionally bad. He's the worst president we've ever had.
Yeah. So
He's an exceptional liar. He's the biggest liar we've ever had. So he's exceptional in those
yeah, totally agree. And
ways.
so the problem
Yeah,
is you got
yeah,
people out there who would rather than help their neighbor, rather than help the polity, they would like to buy ammunition. And that's mentioned in the Salon article. So I'm just
yeah, yeah.
wondering, this is a degradation,
So,
a deterioration, an
right,
emasculation of the notion of exceptionalism, no?
right. So yeah, so uh, so the book itself, the Dissenter's Guide, of course, there could talk all day about that. But to your question, I think the question really is then, and I think I've thought about this for a long time, because my advisor David Noble actually he was a great man, by the way. I love David. He died recently, but really benefited from his tutelage and really miss him. So, but David wrote a lot about American exceptionalism. He wrote actually a book about American exceptionalism in the time period up to World War II. And what David was arguing is that uh, the scholars were trying to find various ways of fitting in their own ideas to the notion that the United States was exceptional, and it became increasingly difficult in the time period of World War II to argue that the United States was exceptional because the United States had spread its army worldwide. It was now engaged in a system that was global, actually, and it was very difficult. It's kind of difficult to maintain one distance from the contagion of the evil of the rest of the world. And so, but where I picked this up is after World War II. I've done just a little bit of research on the attempt to redevelop an idea, a truly kind of powerful idea, dollars of American exceptionalism in the post World War II period. And this is in the 1950s and the 1960s when scholars began to argue that there was such a thing called an American civilization. And and there were textbooks about this, so the scholars were trying to get this into the classrooms, and there were other scholarly arguments that referred to this American civilization, and so um, so there was this argument, and yet by the 1970s, I don't think anybody's talking about an American civilization at
And
that
certainly
point,
nobody
right?
is
I mean,
talking about it now.
right, right.
Nobody is
So
talking
so
about that
this
now.
so this idea did not have enough power to move into the political discourse and to be something that Americans kind of truly gravitated towards. Instead, of course, what happened was the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, and things kind of blew up in a very interesting way in the 1960s. But I think that the notion that the United States was an exceptional place really took a hit in the 1960s with the Vietnam War. And then with the revealing, I mean, it wasn't the civil rights movement itself, but it was the revelation that to the rest of the world, even that segregation existed at very high levels in the South, and that African Americans were being denied their civil rights in very significant ways, which begs the question of how we could claim exceptionalism or an American civilization if we were doing these things to our own citizens. Um, so I think there's this kind of dual track that happens in the 1960s where you have this new kind of cynicism about American government, a well-deserved cynicism after the Vietnam debacle and after the, as I said, the revelations about American racism. And then at the same time, you have the development of a very strong, what I'll call rights consciousness in starting in the 1960s and then going into the 70s, the 80s. And so it's African Americans gain civil rights, and then women want more rights, and then Hispanics want more civil rights, and then disabled people get more civil rights, and so on and so on. And so this idea of liberation and liberty, which is fundamental to what we would call the modern project, this idea of liberation actually gets encapsulated in this country, at least, in these individualistic, individual liberty ways of thinking about it. And this doesn't. I'm just not sure this helps the
no,
idea of civic virtue, the idea that we can claim that we're somehow exceptional. Maybe we can claim we're exceptional in giving up, in repairing the civil rights of the country. Maybe we can claim that as exceptionalism, but I'm not sure that it helps our framework of how we think about
no. How
the
can it?
polity, our
The
relationship
ultimate
to politics.
test, the ultimate
Yeah,
test of any country or society or civilization, if you want to put it that level, is whether whether the people are engaged with the government, whether they know about the government, they support the government, they participate in the government, and whether the government is listening and engaging with the people. So the more collaborative engagement there is between the people and the government, the better, the more optimistic you can be about the future, about the sustainability of this
yeah,
polity.
yeah.
So
In a democracy.
we had all divisiveness for growing divisiveness, I would say, since Vietnam, and
Yeah,
then what accelerated it is the failure of the draft in the early 70s, where we gave up the connection between the military and the civilian worlds. And
yeah,
so that was a parting
yeah.
of the ways
No,
there,
that's
and
very
that enhanced the right wing. But let me ask you this though, you know, if we are into sustainability, um, we need to sustain ourselves physically and technologically. We need to avoid having epidemics and pandemics, because at the end of the day, the philosophical end of things is going to be overtaken by the physical and medical end of things. If your country cannot survive, if your country is in shambles, the way our country was at such great risk in the 30s in the Depression, then we're really not sustainable. So, would you agree with me that the notion of exceptionalism is, and where it's false, where it's not focused on the reality, is a very dangerous business for the sustainability of the country?
Yeah, but I would argue it's not exceptionalism at all. I think exceptionalism is kind of a tool of propaganda in this day and age. Okay,
I
we are
would
so
not
not close
disagree.
to exception. But I would like to argue that we would push for survival and what you're talking about, sustainability, right? Resilience. And in that regard, we need a kind of a renaissance of civic concern. And maybe something like COVID-19 gives us some of that. This idea that neighbors should take care of neighbors, that communities should come together and cooperate when the government asks them to. And the thought is that you're thinking about yourself, but you're thinking about your relationship to one another and to your community and to the government and to politics. So you can't force yourself from that idea, but you actually have to think about yourself in that context. And it's quite important, and we lost that, quite frankly, in the last. Again, I mean, I don't know. I mean, again, what I would say is that we need more study of this. We need an academic study. We need a book on American exceptionalism and civic duty in the post World War II period. And I suppose I'll have to write it at some point. But
I guess you will,
but for
John.
now,
One
for
more
now,
point is
yeah, go ahead.
exceptionalism, the whole notion of federalism is coming into play, because when Trump or others use the term these days, however accurate or inaccurate it is, they're talking about the country in general. And they're willing to take credit for any success, and they're willing to blame somebody else for any failure. That's perfectly corporate of him. But I hate to use the word perfect these days. But what strikes me is that what we see coming out at this long press conference yesterday and other remarks he has made is, I'm not going to do this myself, you guys, and I'm not going to take credit. I'm not going to even tell you I know about it. I want someone else to do it. I want the states to do it. It's kind of a bizarre federalism. All you
Yeah,
states,
yeah,
you
yeah.
fix it. I can't help you. I'm not going to help you. And I'm
Right.
only gonna maybe facilitate some things, and
Yeah.
I'll say what, but I don't take responsibility. You have to take
Right.
responsibility, and that troubles
Well,
me
look.
on a really high,
Yeah.
profound
Of course.
level.
Of course. But I mean, Trump is when there's trouble, Trump is the first one to run and pass the
Yeah,
buck. I mean, this is. I don't think there's any surprise in this. When his company almost went into bankruptcy, what did he do? He went to his creditors and said, "Hey, it's your fault. You need to bail me out." Right. So this is we can't count on civic virtue from Donald Trump, but I think we need to think beyond Donald Trump and not get too fixated on him. And I think to repair this notion of being of having civic virtue, of caring about the community. I think like I say, I think COVID can help that, but I really do think we need to re-energize the notion. My contribution to this would be, at least right now, the Dissenter's Guide, in which I point out that hey, what we have in history is tremendous effort towards civic duty and towards the polity, towards improving the polity, towards reducing injustice, towards making it a better country for the citizens who live in this country. And so we've got some great examples in our past of this. And I think it's I think we don't have to say, look, things are really terrible and we can't recover. What we can say is, hey, we've got a past that we can be proud of in some ways. We don't have to be quite so negative and cynical about how our government has worked in the past. In some ways, this is a different kind of Vietnam syndrome, in that Vietnam invited uh, conscientious citizens to go, "Oh my gosh, this is a terrible, terrible thing that the government has done. They kept secrets from us. They sent our sons into battle to die for no good reason." So I think in some ways we need to get over that Vietnam syndrome, and we can do that by looking in other places for a usable past that allows us to think about our relationship to the threads, the Declaration, the Constitution. We can strengthen those threads, reanimate those threads, and bring those forward into our polity today, and then start thinking about the country again through those things. And then we'll go, wow, we need to take control of things, and we need to repair the damage that's been done.
this may force us to be more introspective. It is forcing us to be more active and proactive on a state level, even a county level. But maybe,
Yeah,
maybe it will connect us better through those new connections with states and counties, and through recognition the federal government cannot solve all our problems, and that we have to
yeah,
solve our problems ourselves as a unified people. I hope that comes true. But I really regret all the suffering, the pain, and the fatalities that lie before us
yeah.
before we get
Of
there.
course, yeah, 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 yeah. Right.
Well, thank you,
Yes, Jay,
John.
I agree. You're
John
welcome, Jay.
David Ann, a history professor who helps us understand the past, the present, and the future from Hawaii
Right.
Pacific University
Okay.
here on History
Take care,
Lens.
Jay.
Thank you so much,
All
John.
right.
Aloha.
Okay. Take care.